Good morning. I do want to start with just a short announcement, perhaps a bit of an acknowledgement. When I took my first class on preparation and delivery of sermons, the book that I was given, titled Preparation and Delivery of Sermons, was written by Tom Holland. And Tom Holland was someone who at that time, just an author of a book. But a couple months later, I suppose, I met him for the first time. And I heard him give a lesson on the book of Isaiah in which he led a series of songs. And within the songs, he would make some points that tied into his lesson. And I was just amazed at his ability to communicate the good news of the Word of God. Anyway, Tom Holland was one of those guys who, if you knew him, whenever you had an opportunity to be around him, you left that experience feeling better and happier and more positive and more faithful. On one occasion that stands out to me, I was just absolutely frustrated with some things that were going on, and I was not feeling good about ministry, and it was just a time in my life that things were not going as I hoped they would. It just so happened, he didn't know this of course, that I heard Tom Holland speak, and he was at a school of preaching where I was, and so he talked about preaching and completely changed my whole way of thinking about ministry and about the way I was feeling about it. And he will probably never know how perfectly timed that lesson was, but of course I do, and God knows. But Brother Holland went to his reward on Thursday of this week. And so I thought I would begin by just acknowledging the good influence that he's had on me, and I dare say many, many others. And so it's a sad and wonderful event that he's passed away. But of course, be praying for his family, and I wanted to just make a short mention of him and his life and the influence that he's had on me and many other people. What I actually want to talk about this morning is the way that we make plans. All right. There's an old saying out there, probably many of you could share it, that, well, maybe you, if I give you the first part, you tell me what the rest is. The saying begins, failing to plan. What is failing to plan? That's right. It's planning to fail. Right? It's doing nothing. Very good. And so we value our ability to look ahead and predict what may or may not happen and make arrangements to account for that. Now, our effectiveness at doing that varies, okay? Dwight Eisenhower said that he'd found that plans weren't very useful, but planning was indispensable. One time in an interview, and I saw this interview, so when I was reminded, I kind of was thinking of it as I was preparing this, I saw Mike Tyson interviewed one time, and his opponent was notoriously good at developing a strategy for every fight. And so the person who was interviewing Mike Tyson brought up the fact, look, this guy is known to really be able to figure out his opponent and what their weaknesses are and make a really good plan to defeat whoever they're fighting. What are you going to do? And Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And of course, That is a variation on something we've all heard, right? We've all heard the saying, that all plans seem good until the bullets start flying, right? And that comes from the military where, there's a lot of planning, but once you make contact with the enemy, it's hard to know what's going to happen. And of course, probably the best known saying about plans comes from Robert Burns. Robert Burns wrote a poem about a man who was plowing a field, and as he plowed the field, he turned over a mouse's nest. Right? Everyone familiar with the poem? Sure. I'm probably going to say it wrong. Robert Burns writes, "But mousie, thou art know thy lane. In proving foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes, O mice and men, gang aft a lee, and a lee us not, but grief and pain for promised joy." Now, for those of you who didn't catch that one little piece, gang aft a lee is a Scottish phrase meaning often go awry. And so the best laid schemes of mice and men often go awry. Now, here's what I want to ask you. Having given you all of those little sayings, where did all those sayings come from? Why do we develop those little pithy things? Who wrote that stuff? Well, they were all written by people who'd made plans, right? And then what happened to their plans? Okay? And so there's a great deal of wisdom contained there. However, let me say that there is one person, one being, for whom all of those sayings about how plans tend to fail is not true. And that, of course, is the God of heaven. I'll take a slide. I left my clicker at the back, so. Perfect. So God, unlike us, can't say the best laid plans often go awry. In fact, God's plans always go perfectly. I'm going to be brief here, but because I think most of us know this to be true, but consider just a couple of things that stand out. In Isaiah chapter 44 and 45, God predicts that Cyrus will be the king who leads his people back from the promised land. Now, that doesn't sound like all that big of a deal until you understand that Isaiah wrote like 150 years before Cyrus even lived. Right? The people of Israel hadn't even been taken into captivity yet when Isaiah wrote that the king who would return them from captivity was Cyrus. In Daniel chapter 8, verses 20 and 21, Daniel is told that the current regime, the Babylonians, who are kind of the world superpower, were going to be overtaken. Now, let me stop here for 1 second. Because I've read some interesting things recently. One lady, Camille Paglia, teaches at Yale, and she has more than once made the point that, and others have as well, that we are living in the end of an era. The U.S. has been the world superpower for, the last 100 years or so, maybe more. But that is winding down, and we're going to see a change. All right? Now, guess what Camille Paglia or anyone else you could read doesn't try to do? They don't try to say, well, here's the next rising power. Right? They don't even try to predict that because there are way too many variables. And yet, in Daniel, writing during the Babylonian era, he's able to write and say, well, these Babylonians, they're going to be kicked out of power by the Medo-Persians. And then, right, he doesn't even just stop there. Then he says, and the Medo-Persians are going to be able to hold power for a certain amount of time, and then the Greeks are going to kick them out. And so God's ability to see what's happening is so far beyond our own. Right? Consider just for a moment even the way that God achieves his goals, right? So in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1, Genesis 12 is where the beginning of the story of Abraham happens. In fact, at the beginning he's called Abram, right? And he's a Babylonian, and God says, get up, leave Babylon, and go to what we now think of as Israel. Right? And God says to Abram, I'm going to make a great nation out of your descendants. Okay? Well, guess what? When God says that to Abraham, Abraham has no kids. Right? Now, I'm not going to go into the whole story, but we could just talk about that this morning. But the point is that God is able to achieve his goals and bring his plans to fruition in ways that we can't even imagine. Of course, the greatest of all of those plans we can read about in Galatians chapter 4, where we read, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And God again does it in a way no one could imagine. Right? He brings the Messiah into the world and achieves redemption, not just, right? Let's think about this for 1 second. When the Jews thought about the Messiah, they were looking for an earthly political leader who would, get rid of the Romans and make them wealthy and powerful and important again, like they had once been under David and Solomon. But God sends a deliverer who can deliver from sin and death and provide eternity in heaven. Paul, commenting on this, by inspiration of course, in 1 Corinthians 2 and verse 9 says, what no eye has seen and what no ear has heard and what no human mind has conceived, the things God has prepared for those who love him. The plans of God are perfect and they're perfectly executed. Now, in contrast to that, I want to think just for a moment about our own plans. If I could have the next point. Proverbs 19 and verse 21 says, there are many plans in the mind of man, but it's the purpose of the Lord that will stand. We tend to not be very good at looking forward and anticipating the things that will happen. I've got a couple of somewhat humorous stories that demonstrate this. A number of years ago, when Google was just starting out, the founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, went to George Bell. George Bell was the CEO of Excite. And they wanted to sell him their search engine. Guess how much for? $1 million. Right? Imagine you're the guy who turned down buying Google for $1 million. Another great example is recently, France spent like $15 billion on a new fleet of trains. Everything was fantastic. The trains got delivered, and when the trains got delivered, it turns out they're too wide to fit in about 1,300, get that number right, 1,300 French train stations. Okay. And so the plans that we create and enact as humans are often pretty limited. And if we took a few minutes, every one of us could tell a story just like the ones I just shared. Right? And if we had, if we could open up a computer and pull up some stories, we could go on and on and on and on, couldn't we? Telling stories just like this. James in chapter 4 and verse 13, says this to us. He says, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go to such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make profit. Yet you don't know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil." So let's have the next slide. Now, if we know that God's plans are perfect and our plans are terrible, what should we do? Should we give up on planning altogether? Just be like, forget that. Just see what happens in the morning? I don't think so, no. In fact, I would suggest that God commands us to do the opposite of that. But I think there are some helpful principles that if we'll adopt them in our lives and we'll think about them as we're planning everything from, hey, what are we going to do this year for vacation, to a job we may take, to anything else, can be extremely helpful to us. So first, don't multiply horses. Now I use that particular phrase because I hoped it would help it stick in your mind a little bit. To those of you who are wondering, what on earth does that mean? Well, in Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 16, God, in fact in Deuteronomy 17, God is giving some instructions about the kings of Israel. One of the instructions he gives is the kings of Israel are not allowed to multiply horses. Why on earth would he give them that direction? Anyone want to make a suggestion? Well, at the time, power and influence and security were often measured by the number of horses you had. And so what God is telling the king of Israel is, you rely on me for your power and for your security. You don't rely on yourself. And to make sure you don't rely on yourself, I'm going to make a rule that says you're not allowed to amass large numbers of horses. The same is true for us. We need to trust God. We need to understand that whatever else may be going on in the world, it's temporary. In fact, in 2 Peter, let's look at 2 Peter just for a second as we kind of wrap up our thoughts here. In 2 Peter chapter 3, we can read, "Since all these things," he means everything, the whole universe, "are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be? In lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God." Now, I think God has to make this warning because we as people, we just have this almost uncontrollable desire to trust ourselves, to trust our own ability and our own achievements, and to think that we've got this all figured out. And as I think about this, I dare say, God must look down at us, and it must look to him an awful lot like it looks to us when we see our children trying to do something that they're not big enough to do. Have you ever seen your kids do that? Right? And you know exactly what's going to happen. Right? In fact, maybe some people even have a rule. Did you have this rule in the house? If you're going to do X, you come and ask Mommy and Daddy for help. Do you have that rule? Right? Some things do it on your own. I think you can handle it. But this is not something you can do on your own. And God has warned us. And I often think he must look down from heaven and just go, right? What are you thinking? And so we need to learn to trust him first of all. Secondly, we need to, another slide, Nita. Not a slide, but the next point. Secondly, we need to surrender all things to him, whatever might be going on in our lives. All right? Proverbs 16:3 says, "Commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established." And you know, I'm not suggesting for a moment that God is concerned with, you know, what time you wake up in the morning or what kind of car you drive or anything like that. However, I am suggesting that in all of those decisions, we should be making God a part of it. Right? If you want to be a mechanic, hey, go nuts, be a mechanic or an accountant or something else. But in your profession, make sure that your aim is to honor God. Consider his ways and his principles first. Next, 3. We don't have numbers, we got arrows. So next arrow. Get your priorities straight. Get your priorities straight. Jesus warns us to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. Now look, the last point we need to make is that none of these principles guarantee that all of your plans will work out perfectly. In fact, we can fairly confidently assume that they won't. But if we embrace these principles, what we can know is that whatever happens in our lives, our relationship with God will not be compromised, and our eternity will be secure. And so, as I've written there, whatever path you plan for your life, right? Whether you want to be a doctor or a garbage man or something in between, whatever you want to do for fun, whatever hobbies you enjoy, right? That's fine. The main path we need to be concerned about is, of course, the straight and narrow path, because there's no way to God except through Christ. And so that's the last thing I want to share with you, and that is, if there are things in your life that are going on that are getting in your way, that are knocking you off of that straight and narrow path, then you need to deal with those things, because that's the path that's ultimately important, and it can't be sacrificed for anything else that we may think we want to achieve. And if you're here and you've never become a Christian, you've never taken that first step and submitted to God through Christ in baptism for the forgiveness of your sins, I would urge you to do so. If you have that need, or if you need the prayers or support of the church, please make it known.